In my presentation, I want to speak about the fragility of man. Especially, I would like to explain to you that fragility is beneficial to man. The point of departure of my presentation is the situation we are in this year, 2020. The coronavirus twice stopped the world economy and transport. In the spring and in the fall, it disabled cultural events and closed churches. COVID-19 has filled hospitals, and in many countries, morgues have become too small. There was no vaccine, no cure, and fear of helplessness reigned among the people. In my presentation, I reflect on the fragility of a man who until recently was convinced that he is omnipotent on this world. In fact, this is a real point of departure of my presentation. So until recently, a man was convinced that he is omnipotent on this world. And I would like to show that his power is not the reason to be number one in the world, but that fragility is beneficial to man. I will start the reflection by the academic debate between Georges Bataille and Jean Danielou, who in the middle of the last century discussed in Paris about sin and sainthood. We have paid attention to the Jesuit thinking, which we think is an appropriate starting point for our topic. Georges Bataille was atheist. On the other hand, we have Jean Danielou, a Jesuit priest, theologian, and member of the French Academy of Immortals. I will introduce the Bataille's conception first. In Bataille's conception, God is self-sufficient. God does not need man. He does not care for man and does not care how he would help him. And in Bataille's conception, saint, because he has approached God, approaches the ideal of perfection in the sense that he too no longer needs anyone. Bataille thus represents a saint who, with his abilities, has attained perfection to such an extent that God should be obedient to him. That is why Bataille's saints does not make mistakes. Moreover, he succeeds in everything he wishes to do well. The Frenchman also understands sin in this logic. In his article, he advocates the idea that sin is something bad because it destroys human self-sufficiency. The sinner, by Bataille's logic, fails in his endeavors and needs the help of another. This is why Bataille considers sin as something bad. So Bataille cannot therefore come to the different conclusion that to the realization that salvation is not possible with such a God. If God is self-sufficient, he does not care for man and does not care how he would help him. So in baptized thinking, there is no place for the salvation of man. In fact, the idea of God's salvation would be also foreign to baptized conception of man. Salvation, the sanctification of man in his logic, could instill in man only the self-sufficiency which he has realized in God. This thinking prompted Danielu to take up the gospel and answer the atheist thinker that this is not the Christian image of God, much less the evangelical image of man, whether saint or sinner. In his critique, he turns atheistic thinking about sainthood and sin self from the bondage of sin, because the belief that God must obey man is sinful. Danielu continues his reflection that we can only speak about sainthood when man accepts the grace of God that frees man from sin. To be free from sin, then, means to be aware of his smallness before God. We could write concisely, to be free from sin means to accept the weakness of human nature. Consequently, the sign of sainthood is the acceptance of God's will, even when it is necessary to endure defeats. In fact, the French Jesuit is convinced that the foundation of sainthood is the awareness that in life man has received everything from God, victories and defeats. Man achieved nothing thanks to himself. God saves man from destruction by rescuing him from the illusion of a perfect union with God. God tells him that man can communicate with him only when he also accepts complete separation from him, even though man thinks he should unite with God. Every generation in the history of mankind has suffered one way or another. Natural disasters, diseases, or wars have marked people of all times. Basically, every person experiences setbacks and failures in their personal lives. Rarely does anyone ask what God wants to tell us with such events, or what sense do such events have in human life. However, we must acknowledge that the question of evil is connected with the deepest secret of life, which can also be explained by an even greater secret, which is love itself. As we read the Bible, we are tempted to interpret all evil as sin. But as we have seen, the suffering Job rejects this explanation. This logic of thought is also rejected by Jesus, who in healing the blind man, for example, emphasizes that neither he nor his parents sinned, but that all this happened to reveal God's work to him. It is this evangelist's emphasis on the fact that all suffering and evil can be understood only in the light of God's love. Christian anthropology speaks of the relationship between man and a personal God. Each man, through conscience, recognizes what is good and what is bad. A believer also recognizes through God's revelation what is good and what is bad. Both strive to achieve good as well. However, in our weakness and fragility, we can admit with the Apostle Paul that we do what we do not want. Paul is aware of his mistakes, but he cannot avoid them. In addition, man experiences failures at work, his body is fragile, and it could be attacked by an invisible virus. In our thinking, we realized that man is weak according to God's will, and so accepting fragility leads man to God and another man. Man can be thankful to God for fragility because it reminds him of imperfection and encourages him to build community. In the Christian ascetic, we call this humility. So I could say that awareness of imperfection leads me to humility and then to community. That is why the Apostle Paul boasts of his weaknesses. Yes, I am glad to be weak or insulted or mistreated or to have troubles and sufferings if it is for Christ. Because when I am weak, I am strong. May the coronavirus be a reminder to our generation against the self-sufficiency that leads man to selfishness. A man in the person of Adam does not need God. He does not need his commandments and prohibitions. Man in the person of Jesus Christ, however, wants God's will to happen. Jesus is one with the Father. To today's man, weaknesses must not lead to self-sufficiency, but to faith, which is the search for God and the other man. Thank you.